The ability to think well is like having a superpower in a world that's led by their emotions, because that's the world these kids are growing up in. They are growing up in a world completely led by their emotions. And man, when they have a little bit of ability to think for themselves, they don't fall for it. They recognize it.
Bombarded is a pretty good word to describe how I feel when I'm trying to absorb just a news item or something in social media. We are bombarded with information every day. But how often do we stop and ask, is this actually true? I mean, so many faulty arguments and so much emotional manipulation are part of this whole process. If we don't think critically, we risk being deceived. As Christians, we are called to love God with our minds, not just with our feelings. And logical thinking isn't often taught, especially to young people. Well, we need to change that. So today, we're diving into why discernment matters, common logical fallacies, and how Jesus transforms not just what we believe, but how we think. My guest for the show is Kathy Gibbens. She's a passionate educator, speaker, and podcast host who is dedicated to equipping the next generation with critical thinking skills. I love this. As a homeschool mom, business owner, Bible study creator, she discovered the power of logical reasoning when her daughter studied logical fallacies for school. And what began as a fun learning experience turned into a mission to help other people recognize good and bad thinking in everyday life. So Kathy is driven by a deep concern for the rising generation, and she's launched the Filter It Through a Brain Cell podcast to teach discernment skills in a world where it's very difficult for people to do that. She believes that truth exists, that thinking well is the foundation to loving God with our minds. And so let's welcome Kathy Gibbens to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Kathy, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Jeff. I'm super excited to be here.
I've been on your show before.
Yes, you
and
have.
I've been looking forward to your coming on our show because the word truth is super important to you.
Yes.
Teaching critical thinking skills to lead people toward the truth. Talk, before we dive into all the questions I have about our culture and how truth is viewed and why we should teach critical thinking skills, can you give us a little insight into how you got into this?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So I was a homeschool mom, homeschooling my daughter, and the year that she was in the 7th grade was 2019, 2020. And as we all know, what happened in 2020, right? With the pandemic and rolling into the internet fact checkers and then a presidential election. Well, that year, as part of her homeschool curriculum, she read a book, and I was directing her little class. We homeschool with classical conversations. And so we meet once a week in community, and I was directing her class. So me and these 12 students read this book called The Fallacy Detective. And it was just introducing logical fallacies. This was new to me. I had never learned this. I had a good education, but I had never learned about logical fallacies. And the kids loved it. Like they picked it up really fast. They loved it. They had fun with it. Like it was just the perfect thing for them to be learning at that age in development. Well, an interesting thing happened as we go into the pandemic and all the craziness that was happening with it. These kids picked up on all the craziness that was happening. And not only could they recognize it, but they could name it. And I realized as I watched them go through that time as compared with other kids who didn't have this information, they weren't learning about logical fallacies. And it was just an introduction to basic logic. It wasn't even a big deep dive. They went through that time period so differently. And I thought, oh my goodness, with just a little bit of training, these kids, you can't fool them. Like they picked up on it so easily and so naturally, and their anxiety levels were less. And and watching a political debate with a bunch of kids who are trained, they were like, well, that's a red herring. That's an ad hominem. And I was like, oh my goodness, our country would be in such a different place right now if we just as a society had these skills and were able to think about and discern what's true and what's not true. It's a foundational stepping stone, I believe, to discernment. And so I thought, well, I can do something about that. So I started a podcast. I teach critical thinking. Kind of my age group that I really love talking to is middle schoolers and high schoolers. Short, fun episodes so that parents can play it in the car when they're running to soccer practice, and both parents and students can learn together and have conversations and point at the billboard and said, tell me what you think of that, right? And practice their skills. And so that's how I started it. And it's just been a fun ride.
Your podcast is called Filter It Through a Brain Cell.
Yes.
So anybody who thinks, oh, that would be a great tool for us to have as a family, you can check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's fun.
Well, I would love to dig into what you're seeing in the culture, because as you mentioned, with the students watching the political debate, they could very quickly pick out the fact that there's a lot of illogic that's just part of everyday life. I find I can't even look at Facebook anymore.
Yeah.
Because I'm finding that I look at it and I think, well, that's not even how can I engage with that? That's not even a legitimate argument that the person is making. And I'm moving away from that. But, no matter where you go, you're going to see misinformation. You're going to see appeals to emotion. You're going to see half-truths. So why do you think as a culture, we're in this place where we're just not intelligently processing the things that are necessary for our survival as a nation and for our families and for us individually?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I think some of it is it wasn't valued. There was a time in our country's history when logic used to be taught in schools. It used to be taught in the public school system. And it was around the 50s and 60s or so that they started going toward the mandatory testing. And so that, it became where it wasn't, they didn't necessarily remove it, but it became where it wasn't a core required teaching because they were teaching for the test, and then it just kind of drifted away. And there are some schools, most of them probably private schools, that will still do some teaching in logic, but it's not very common. And so it became less valued. And then we roll into, we are living in a and your audience knows this probably very well, a postmodern society, and relativism is ruling the day. And so what happens in relativism is there is no objective truth. And so we're living in a society that says there is no objective truth. And if you claim that you have objective truth, you're wrong. Objectively, interestingly, but right. But you're wrong because relativism rules the day. So relativism says, I get to say what's true for me. You get to say what's true for you. Even if those two things are exact opposites, they have to both be true, and you just have to accept that, or we'll call you names, essentially is what it amounts to.
And so, the name calling is a huge part of it.
It's a huge part of it.
Now, if you make a logical argument, somebody might say, well, the reason you're focused on logic is because you're a racist, or you're enshrining a patriarchal society, or you're homophobic, or whatever.
And that's all it boils down to is name calling. And it's like, so what we've done is we've fallen into this society where the most important thing about us and the thing that is most true about us, according to society, is how we feel and how we experience life. And because we feel something, therefore it must be true. And everybody around us has to get on board with that truth. And this is what these kids are being told. This is what they have been told. They weren't even like me. I feel like I got to grow up hearing sanity and hearing truth and understanding that there is truth and not truth and non-truth, truth and lies. But this generation, they're not getting that message unless they're getting it at home. They're getting a message from society that is completely relativistic, and that if they don't get on board with it, they will either be shamed or they are wrong somehow. And we have to give them the message that no, there is truth. There are names for these tactics that people, like the name calling is an ad hominem. As soon as they learn the name, now they can call it out and they can recognize it. Oh, that's just an ad hominem attack, right? And they realize it. We give them something solid that they can wrap their brain around so that it's tools to recognize truth is the way that I like to look at critical thinking.
It occurs to me, Scripture in Proverbs says that there's life and death is in the power of the tongue. And so when someone calls somebody a name, it's as if they are cursing that person rather than blessing them. And if you don't have the tools, you might receive that curse rather than deflect it. But if you have the tool to say, I know what that is, that's ad hominem.
Yep.
That's a name-calling logical fallacy. It bears no relationship to the point that I'm actually making. It's just that person trying to attack me. Then you can deflect the cursing that the person is trying to put on you rather than the blessing. But it feels so frustrating sometimes when we have this whole society based on the idea that we can control people by cursing them, essentially, by using illogic to make them feel bad. That somehow if we make them feel ashamed, then we have made them wrong.
Yep. And it's crazy. And again, to me, this is the power of giving our kids these tools, because once they learn, and you've already said it, once they learn it's a fallacy, it's an appeal fallacy, an appeal to emotion. So an appeal to anger, an appeal to shame, an appeal to guilt. If a student can recognize, oh, well, that was an appeal to emotion, they're trying to make me feel guilty. They're trying to make me feel ashamed. Now, just like you said, they don't have to own it. They don't have to take that on. I just listened to on a podcast episode, this woman was talking about her son, and her son in society is coming to her and saying, Mom, I'm the problem. I am a white male in the patriarchy. I am the problem. I don't fit into society. I don't fit into church. And I thought, he's been listening to lies. He's 100% been listening to lies, and he's taken it and he's owned it. But if he could recognize what these arguments are for what they are, they're lies, he wouldn't be owning this as his, as his identity. And I just think it's so important for us parents. We have got to give our children an identity that's based on truth and equip them to know why it's true and to know why these messages are not right.
You know, Kathy, I hear a lot of, I started hearing this when I was in graduate school, where people would say, well, you're using patriarchal logic, or something like that. And the idea was, in fact, I had a classmate who was going to try to write a dissertation to try to tear down logic as an artifact of patriarchy. But what kind of arguments is she going to make?
I don't know.
It was so frustrating in class because you could never pin her down on it. Anytime you would get to the place where you would say, well, surely you're going to try to make a logical argument on behalf of your perspective. Are you not? And she would always somehow turn it back into an attack on you. And I was so glad. It was my last year in my doctoral program. So it's like, I'm so glad I don't have to spend the next 3 years with this person in class. But it was crazy and frustrating. But, how do you break that spell? I mean, go back to that young man that you were talking about. What should that mom say to her son to help break that? It's almost like he's put himself under a voodoo curse or something.
Yeah, it is, I think, a version of a curse. We just speak the truth. This is what we do to our kids, is we speak the truth. Like you've talked about in your book, the truth changes everything. And when the great C.S., I think it's a C.S. Lewis truth. You don't need to defend the truth. You just need to let it out. The truth is like a lion. I may have misattributed that. But I think there's a lot of power when we can teach our children what is true. Even if they seem like, well, but they're being pulled in this direction. If they have heard the truth, it takes fruit in their life. And here's the other thing that I believe critical thinking does, is it teaches us how to love God with our mind. Now, this is something that we hear, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind, all thy strength, right? And we can imagine what it means to love God with our heart. We can have those feelings and our strength. Okay, let's go do something. But what does it mean to love God with our mind? Well, Scripture tells us. It tells us in 2 Corinthians 10:5. Okay, so we are to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God and take captive every thought to make it obedient to God. Well, what does that mean? What does take captive every thought? Okay, that's telling us we are to do something. That's telling us we have a choice and a say in the matter, and there is a skill involved with that. And if we don't give our kids the tools, how are they going to take thoughts captive? When they are taught, no, whatever thought pops into your mind must be true. Well, that's not what scripture says. We take these thoughts captive and make it obedient to Christ. We make it obedient to the truth. Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, what does it mean to renew our mind? Like, God cares deeply about our minds and about what we think. He gives us a whole list in Philippians of the things that we're supposed to think about. And at the top of the list, we are told to think about whatever's true. Right? Whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is praiseworthy, think on these things. So we are explicitly commanded to think about truth. And so if we are able to give our kids the tools so that they can do that, it's almost like it's built in. When you give tools to think rightly and to think about truth, it's built in discernment. That is how discernment gets built. And then having the ability to practice that, to practice the discernment and to practice recognizing bad arguments and good arguments, just like what you guys do there at Summit. My daughter's been, she loved it. She's coming back this summer as well. So
I love it. Well, it's great to have her. I met her last summer and she said, "You were on my mom's podcast." And
yeah.
Who's your mom? Oh, yeah. So I better make very clear arguments for you, huh? But this, your truth versus my truth, emotional arguments, misinformation, half-truths. I don't want to make people cynical about their experience in church, but we need to be aware that there's a Christianized version of each of these things. That there are people who, instead of rejecting untruth, try to find a way to accommodate it. And so it does make its way into the church. And again, recognizing we don't want to become cynical. We want to help others learn to understand and speak the truth, just as you were sharing. But what do we need to be on the lookout for in the Christianized version of these ideas?
Yeah, I call it bad ideas with a little bit of Jesus icing on top, right? A lot of times people can present bad ideas, but if you say it nicely enough, if you say it with enough Christian language around it, spread a little Jesus on top and serve it up, people will just take it and they'll, without thinking, but this person, they say that they love Jesus and they say that, they love the Bible. So anything they say must be true. And this is the thing that I tell people. I say, look, we have to always be thinking. We have to always be exercising wisdom from all the sources, not just from the people that we've decided we don't agree with, but also from the people that we've decided we do agree with. And here's the thing. Somebody told me one time, you should always go into every conversation willing to be persuaded. And when he said that, it kind of caught me. And I thought, I didn't like that. Because I thought there are some things right now that I don't think I'm willing to be persuaded on, like things about my faith and things about what I believe about God or Jesus, for example. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, okay, well, it's kind of like this. If you've got the idea that you think and another idea that somebody's presenting to you, we should never be afraid of digging in and pushing back and forth on the ideas as long as the goal is when you push back and forth that you buckle toward truth. Because if you go in and you're willing to be persuaded on something and the goal is truth, if what you believe is true, you'll always wind back up there again in the same place if it's true. But if you seek for truth and you wind up someplace else, maybe you need to rethink what you were believing, right? And so many times people are so afraid to look at, okay, well, what do I believe? Why do I believe what I believe? Is what I believe true? These are the big questions of life, right? These big questions that kids have, that students have. And I say, wrestle with it. Go there. Yes, ask the questions, ask the hard things, just like what you guys do. Because if the goal is truth, you will wind up, if what you believe is true, that's where you're going to wind up again. And so we never have to be afraid of seeking, as long as we're seeking truth and understanding that there is truth and that we can know it. And it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of man is to seek a matter out. This is what he designed us to do. So we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't have to be afraid of the truth. We just have to be willing to find it and to say, okay, no, there is truth and we can know it. And this is part of the job of man is to seek it out. And I think that helps parents a lot because they don't have to be afraid of their kids' big questions. They don't have to be afraid of their kids, this whole deconstruction movement that's happening right now. A lot of parents are really afraid of that. And I say, dive in. Have the conversation. Have the conversation with your kids. Let them ask the questions. Teach them to think rightly about this. And you don't have to worry about where are we going to end up. As long as the truth is the plumb line, you're going to end up probably in a really good place.
I love that word picture of buckling toward the truth. That makes a lot of sense. And it seems like if we could have that perspective, then we wouldn't be afraid. But I think a lot of parents are afraid, to be honest. I mean, a child can go on the internet and research, quote unquote, something, and 5 minutes later, they're an expert. And so they come to their parent with an argument that their parent hasn't heard before, and they feel ashamed. They feel unequipped. They feel that they somehow let their child down. They somehow feel that they let Jesus down because they didn't know how to respond in that moment. Yeah. I'd love for you to speak to that as a mom, because I think of that as when I'm thinking of that in my dad interactions with my kids as well.
Yeah. No, that's a big one. And that is that's a big place as parents. And I think a couple things. What's really important for us as parents is to get really good saying, I don't know. Let's look into this. Let's check it out.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
It's the whole, let's be the lead learner. That is interesting. I've never heard that before. Let's dive into that. Let's see if that's true. If we can be the lead question asker, I wonder about this. Why don't we look into this a little bit? And why don't we check this out? And where are they coming from? And why do you think they said that? Right? So if we can just be willing to jump in with them, okay, they found this and they brought this to us and they're concerned about this and they seem to be going down this road. It's not, oh no, let's panic. It's, hey, this is a fantastic opportunity. You know what? I don't know about that either, but let's look into it. Let's look into this. Let's ask some questions and let's dive in and see what the truth is and see what we can figure out. And this is why, I love teaching to middle schoolers. They are kind of my heartbeat right now, because I feel like if we can get them this natural phase of development, every parent of teenagers knows that once their kids hit the middle school age, all they want to do is argue. They want to argue. They'll ask, what time is it? You say it's 12 o'clock. No, it's not. It's 12:01. Right? Like they will argue about anything. It's raining outside. No, it's not. It's sprinkling outside. Okay, whatever. It's their natural development. Like this is the development process that they're going through that God has happening in their brain. Well, I say, rather than telling our kids, stop arguing with me, right? As a parent, I don't know how many times I've said this. I've done it. Stop arguing with me. How about we teach them how to argue, but how to do it well? And if we can help them develop this skill at that age, now when they get a couple years in the future, now you've got something solid. You've got a solid foundation that you can start having these conversations with them on. You can say, okay, well, that's a good point. But did you notice that how that kind of seems to be an equivocation? They've changed the meaning of that word. What do you think they mean when they say love is love? And you have a language and they have a skill and they have something that they can, a basis, a foundation to now start thinking about it a little bit differently. So I think those are really important things for parents to say, I don't know either. Let's figure it out. Let's dive in. Let's ask some good questions.
Yeah, this is why filter it through a brain cell is so critical for your kids when they are going through puberty. They're in their teenage years. I think of, I had two brothers, so there are three boys and one girl in my family. And then I had two sons and two daughters. Their experience going into puberty was completely different. The kinds of discussions and arguments that we had really did break down by whether they were male or female. But you find yourself realizing that children at some point will fight you to prove that they're grown up. Yeah. Okay. And part of the fighting is if you aren't releasing them to think in a mature fashion as adults, then they will fight you until you will either give up or acknowledge that they have become adults, right? And so what you're suggesting is a very different approach. Just you're granting them, in a way, the ability to think clearly. This is how mature adults think about things, and this is a gift that I want to give to you. How different will that make all of those little tiffy, spats that we so often have.
Yeah, I have to believe that it does. I have to believe that, like you said, it does empower them. It empowers them to not feel like they're at the whims of society and society's messages. I always say this. The ability to think well is like having a superpower in a world that's led by their emotions, because that's the world these kids are growing up in. They are growing up in a world completely led by their emotions. And man, when they have a little bit of ability to think for themselves, they don't fall for it. They recognize it. It's kind of amazing. It is a little bit like a suit, a coat of armor, or a helmet for their brain to protect them against some of these crazy messages.
Kathy, one thing I hear a lot of times in churches is, well, you can't think your way there. You have to feel your way there toward the truth. What we're doing here is learning to feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. We're not learning to think. And it bugs me when I hear that. And surely there are some people who are more focused on thinking and other people who are more focused on feeling. But where did we get the idea that faith is not something that we are to think about?
That's a great question. It's, to me, I think it's the emotionalism. I think it's people who have been taught to be mentally lazy. It's people who have not done the work to find answers to questions. It's when we have equivocated the word faith. And again, to equivocate means to change the meaning of a word in the middle of an argument. So somehow we went from faith being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see to kind of being I hope it's true, right? This is not what faith is. Faith is not like I think it's true. I hope it's true. I have this feeling, or I had this feeling at church, so it must be true. If we have nothing solid to base our faith on, other than a feeling, other than emotion, even if it's a good feeling or a good emotion, that's not what the Bible says faith is. Faith is being sure. Faith is being certain. Faith is knowing what we believe and why we believe it and having that understanding. And I think when we give that over to, everybody wants to feel good, but the problem with feelings is that they change very quickly, often. Several times throughout a day. We can go through a range of feelings. Well, does that mean that the truth is changing often, several times a day, over and over again? No, it doesn't. And so we have to understand, we have to put the emotions in their rightful place, right? God gave us emotions and feelings, and they're not bad, they're not wrong, but they're there for information, to inform us, not to guide us, not to lead us, not to control us. And when we can understand the difference between the two, I think it just puts us on a much more solid ground.
Yeah, I love that. I remember G.K. Chesterton talked about faith, hope, and love as the unreasonable virtues. Unreasonable because there isn't anything in human anthropology that would suggest that those three virtues are going to help you live the kind of life that you need to live. It's entirely from a spiritual perspective. But they're virtues, which I thought was really important, not feelings. Faith, hope, and love are not primarily about how you feel. They're more like the navigational buoys that you go between if you're riding in a boat, to make sure that you stay away from the areas of the channel where your boat will go aground and be damaged, and possibly the danger to the people who are aboard. If we were to think of our faith in that way, rather than just as, well, how did I feel about today's service? More of, how did this enable me to gain the strength to be a virtuous person in the areas where it matters the most? We'd be having a very different experience on Sunday mornings for sure.
Oh, 100%. I 100% agree with you, Dr. Jeff. And, people want to feel something, and I think that's fine as long as we run it through, we filter it through truth, like the lens of truth. Yeah. I just feel like that this is such an important foundational thing. If we can teach our kids to know that there is truth, to know that we can know it, and to love the truth. Like you said, it is a virtue. Truth is a virtue. And are we teaching our children to love it? And I think that's not a concept that we really understand in society, that we should be loving the truth. We should be truth lovers and seeking it for the greater good of ourselves and for society. But if we could love the truth, now when you love something, you protect it, right? You look out for it, you honor it, and you treat it like it's valuable and like it means something. And I feel like that's where it starts. If we can teach our children to love truth in our homes, it makes a difference.
Deuteronomy 6 is a passage that we often talk about when it comes to parenting. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all of your strength, and to teach your children about these things when you rise up, when you lie down, when you are travel by the way, when you are at home, and so forth. Why do you think, why do you think, because Christianity is so different, the Judeo-Christian worldview is so different from most religions in this. Why is it that God puts such an emphasis on thinking and loving God with our thoughts as well as with our feelings and with our actions?
Well, we're told, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, right? Out of the wellspring of a heart, a man lives. And so I think God, this is how he designed us. Like, we are his creation. We are his design. And from our thoughts come our feelings. The way that two people could both be sitting in the same traffic jam, having two very different thoughts and feelings. One person could be really angry. The other person could be relieved because they didn't want to go to whatever it is that they're now going to be late for. But it's based on their thinking. How we think determines how we treat people. How we think determines how we act, the things that we do and that we don't do. And so I think it just comes back to the fact that God designed us this way. He designed us in his image. He designed us to be thinking, and out of that determines how we live and how we live in this life that he's given us to live. And so our thoughts will determine a lot about our life. They will determine who we are, who we become, how we treat people. And all of those things matter to God, right? Because he says he has a purpose and a plan for us. And that's where it all stems from. Out of the wellspring of, as a man thinketh, so is he. And I'm not saying that in a way that, let me, the crazy stuff. I don't know if you've had Melissa Daughtry on your podcast yet, but the whole thing, like, I'm going to think myself into XYZ. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about we need to think on what's true because it will affect how we live our life.
Yeah. Kathy, would you say there's a difference between the way logic would be taught in a secular setting and the way it should be taught in a Christian setting? Because I learned it. I had a logic class at university, and it was great for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and then it got pretty thick. I mean, it was hard, but it was completely secular. God never came up. It was just looking at, is this formulation logical? And it got to the point where it was more like math than it was like an argument class.
Yeah, formal logic gets a little weird and heady. Yeah, it for sure can. So I would say, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, so how would you teach it differently based on Jesus? How does Jesus transform our thinking as opposed to just sheer rationality?
Well, and here's what's interesting. Being in this space, there have been times that I have put things up onto social media, and for whatever reason, when you go down the critical thinking route, the atheists show up out of the woodwork and have a lot to say. And here's what I realized is that for a lot of these atheists, their mind and critical thinking has become the thing that they worship. It has become their God, right? We are made to worship. And so they now kind of put themselves in the place of God. And the way that they do it is their ability to think. That's where they're putting their faith. And they think they can kind of out-logic anybody. And coming at it from a Christian perspective, the whole difference is what are we worshiping with that, right? So the atheists, they're coming at it and they're worshiping the thinking. Whereas we as Christians, the thinking is a tool to worship God, who is the way, who is the truth, who is the life. So our end goals are very different. We're not thinking for the sake of just thinking. We are thinking because it is a way that leads us to truth. It's a way that leads us to know God. Because The reality is all truth is God's truth, right? Ultimately, if there is any truth, it's because it belongs to God and he's revealed it to us so we can know it through him. The other thing that I always like to say, because I get this question and it is that critical thinking is not teaching your kids to be critical. I've gotten this question more. Yes, I've gotten this question. It kind of surprised me the first time. I thought, oh, we don't even know what critical thinking is. But because I've had parents say, well, this mean you're teaching your kids to criticize and to be critical? And I'm like, oh, no. I mean, maybe a little bit, but critical as in like important thinking, not necessarily thinking in order to criticize.
Yeah.
Now, yes, we're asking, is this a good question? And that way we might be, but no, we're not teaching kids to be critical in critical thinking.
Yeah, so it's the difference between worshiping the thinking and worshiping through the thinking toward God.
Yes.
And then the idea of being able to discern, that's a great word too. Being able to discern, not to become cynical.
Yeah.
I don't remember if this is in Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, or if it's just my sort of summary of what he said, but a hard heart is not a good substitute for a soft head. Mm. You have to have strong thinking, even as your heart is tender toward the truth. Mm. And so, anyway, you can't be cynical about what is happening around you. You still, as you mentioned earlier, have to base everything on hope. But as we get ready to wrap up here, what are some of the things that give you hope? You've spent a lot of time now teaching a lot of parents and working with a lot of kids. Are you seeing any trends that could give us sort of light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing with this generation, I have a daughter who's Gen Z, and, that's a lot who I've worked with. I've been in classrooms these last 6 years, well, more than that really, but with high schoolers, middle schoolers, and high schoolers. And one of the trends that I'm seeing, and it's not like I've got this long history in education, but man, I feel like these kids, they do care. They want to know the truth. I think they're getting to a point where it's gotten so ridiculous in society that they're just, I just see a strong dose of common sense really being valued by a lot of these kids that are coming up. I think the pendulum swung so far into the ridiculous that they're just like, no, they're searching for real. They're searching for true. And if you can give that to them, if you're not afraid to say, no, this is real and this is true and we can know it, and you don't have to be afraid of name calling, it doesn't matter, then they appreciate that and they can love that. I think we have a real opportunity to teach this generation to love truth. And I think it matters to them. And so that gives me hope. And it gives me hope that that they enjoy it as well. Like, I think it's so different from what they're seeing in society that they're like, yeah, this actually makes sense to me. And it gives me a tool and I'm able to use this. And so I think that's one of the things that does make me hopeful for this next generation.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of hope there. It actually led me to another question, though, that I didn't think that I would be asking. How do you, in that process of them learning to think clearly, how do you help them discern whether an argument is worth engaging?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Some of that comes down, I teach them to ask questions, right? Because when you ask somebody a question, you can determine whether they're actually wanting to know. And
okay.
Right, because if somebody, because just like your experience on social media, I think all of us are seeing that and feeling that like for the most part, there's very little, ability to kind of go back and forth with most people because they don't care. They're not interested in hearing. They're not interested in learning. So I think one of the biggest tools that we can teach kids is to ask questions. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Okay, when you say that, and then see what you're getting back. See what the person gives you back. If they're not willing to engage you in the questions, it might just be time to walk away. Because again, we have to protect what God has given us. The resources He's given us is our time, is our energy, is our love. And it comes with some discernment there as well, is that, okay, this is a place where it would be good for me to engage. And this is a place, right? I have an episode that I did on what do you do if somebody commits a logical fallacy in a conversation? Do you just call it out? Do you say, well, that was a red herring, right? Or, how do you engage with that person? And unfortunately, the answer is it depends. But the answer is really, it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the situation. And that's where a little bit of that discernment has to come in.
Yeah, that's true. A mentor of mine used to say, just because a dog is barking at you doesn't mean you have to stop and kick it.
Yes. You might just walk on by that dog.
Just keep on walking.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, wow. This has been fun. I love this. I love how you pull the pieces of critical thinking together with godly spirituality. You have such a positive demeanor and attitude as you approach all of these things, which makes it more fun to learn it.
Well, and Dr. Jeff, that is one of my things. That's one of my hearts for parents. I feel like so many parents are nervous about this topic because they didn't learn it. And so it feels intimidating. And it's these words that they don't like, oh, post hoc. I've never heard of that before. What is that post hoc? And I'm like, no, it can be fun. If that's why I do short episodes. I try to make it fun so that the kids are engaged, they understand it. And I want parents to know this is so accessible. This is accessible for you. This is accessible and fun for your kids, and just let it be a part of your life. Let it just be something you're doing in the car when you're running to get the groceries. It doesn't have to be difficult, but what a gift that you're giving to your kids, because once they have it, nobody can take it away. It's like hiding scripture in your heart. Nobody can take that. Once they have the tools for learning good thinking, nobody can take that. They'll have it for the rest of their life.
It's so good. I believe that. Well, I love it. We've covered a lot of great ground here, and I just feel a sense of freedom that we don't have to be cynical and negative and angry just because the culture around us is cynical, negative, and angry. Instead, we can worship through our thoughts and worship God, the one true God, and then bring that whole demeanor into everything else we do. It's going to make such a big difference. Kathy, thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you, Dr. Jeff.
Thank you to my guest, Kathy Gibbens, for coming on the show today. You can learn more about Kathy's work at filterthroughabraincell.com. That's a long one. filterthroughabraincell.com. Well, does your teen or student have questions about the Christian worldview and its truthfulness? Do they need some good thinking skills? That's why I'm encouraging you to check out Summit's 12-day Biblical Worldview Conference and Camp for Young Adults. During these 2 weeks, we equip students to defend, to own, and to live out a biblical worldview and build community with other young adults. We tackle issues like God's existence, the Bible's authority, the work of Jesus, and more. And I will tell you, because when we're recording this, most of these programs are full for this summer, but there is an online option that is fun and exciting and engaging for students 13 and up. So just go to summit.org/conferences for more details. We want to connect with you this summer. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.